So last week we ended a series we've been on for several weeks called Whose Kingdom? Next week we're going to be starting a new series. It's going to be on us as a body aligning to the mission that God's given us. Us operating as a family, us operating as different parts of the body of one unit. Different functions, different gifts. How do we align to the mission that God has placed before us? How do we know what our purpose is? If we're going to know our purpose, it's going to require us to know His voice as well. It says that Jesus gave the fivefold ministry for the equipping of the saints to build on the cornerstone. How do those different giftings operate? How do they operate together? What are the pitfalls that the enemy would like to use to create wedges between people of different giftings? We're going to go through a whole series on that. How do we operate as a family, as a unit, in the mission, in the call that God's given us as a church, as a body? But in this week in between, I was asking the Lord what was on His heart for me to share this morning. And I felt like He wants to dive into storms. I don't know if Josh looked at my notes. Where's Josh? When he gave that word, I was like, somebody's hearing something. But I felt like He was wanting us to dive into storms. How do we navigate storms? Storms will come. When I was sitting in Pastor Anthony's office, Pastor Anthony was the former pastor of Hope. And unexpectedly, God was seemingly calling him to Wisconsin to take on a church. And He brought me into His office and He said, Seth, I would never have expected this. I think I've been called to Wisconsin. I've been asking the Lord who's supposed to take the church. And he said, you. But He goes, would you even accept it if it was extended to you? And so we had this conversation of if I would even accept it. He goes, at the end of the meeting, he says, you need to go seek the Lord because you need to know you're called if you're going to step into this. This is not something you can step into just to try and lend a helping hand or just to try and fill a role. He said, you have to know you're called. He said, when things get hard, you have to know you're called. When storms come, you have to know you're called. When things don't go at all according to plan, you have to know you're called. Otherwise, you'll bail. Because when you know you're called, when you know you're where God's meant you to be, it doesn't matter what the storm is. You have the confidence and the reassurance that He's taking you somewhere. And He's going to fulfill what He's set out to do through you. And the same is relevant to each one of us in our calling. Sometimes I think the enemy has way more of an influence when the storms come because we're not confident in what God's called us to. So we're going to talk about that in this next series. How do we know what our purpose is? How do we know what our calling is in a season? That's also why in our discipleship programs, we develop this, particularly in part that's starting in a week or so. How do we know what our purpose is, what our call is? So important in the storm. The enemy will also try and get us in isolation in storms. He'll try and pick us off because he knows we're much more vulnerable when we separate from the family of God. He tries to get us in isolation. He tries it every time. He'll use shame. He'll use whatever he can do to get you separated. Because he knows that you're going to have a much harder time weathering a storm in isolation than when you're walking in community through a storm. When I moved up here, I'd heard a lot about how rainy Seattle is. And I expected that there would be storms all the time. But I get up here and I realize you guys don't have storms up here. It just drizzles constantly. In Arizona, we don't get a lot of rain. We don't have a lot of storms. But when we have a storm, oh boy, we have a storm. One of my favorite times of year is actually right about now. July, August is the monsoon season in Arizona, where seasons are shifting and we have these massive, powerful storms. Here's a picture of one. Imagine coming home from work one night and you look out off on the horizon and you see a mile-high dust storm like that coming towards the metro of Phoenix. They can be powerful. They don't happen often. They're not very long, but they are wild storms. Dust, wind, lightning, thunder, the whole gamut. And then the rain comes afterwards and washes everything off. Now, every once in a while, we'll get a torrential downpour. A typical year in Arizona will get 7 to 8 inches of rain a year. But there can be these like 100-year storms, and we actually had 2 of them within a 3-year span in 2014 and 2017 when I was in college and grad school. And I was going to GCU at the time, so we're in West Phoenix. And in 24 hours, we got 7 to 8 inches of rain. And a city like Phoenix cannot handle that much rain in 24 hours. So this is what happened. The city flooded. That's the Brewers spring training facility. 2 of their fields are just underwater. Imagine going to work and being this guy in the next slide. Just going to work. Can't ride your bike because the water's practically over the wheels. Here's one more. Driving's going to be tough. That's the I-10. That's like a 6 or 7 lane freeway, completely underwater. The news that day, because it's warm in Phoenix in July and August, people were swimming down the interstate. There are some wild storms. The title of today's sermon is called The Eye of the Storm. And we're actually going to be asking the question, where are your eyes during the storm? Where is your gaze fixed in the midst of the storm? Going off the last series we were in, are they fixed on yourself or your kingdom? Because there might be a storm going on, your kingdom might be tottering, your focus might be on everything that you've worked for. And God's saying, just let it go. Kingdom's not going to last. Is our eye fixed on the storm itself? Is our eye fixed on the kingdom of darkness? You could spend all kinds of time with all of your preoccupied attention on the storm itself. It's not going to help you. We're not meant to live with eyes fixed on the kingdom of darkness. Are our eyes fixed on Jesus and his kingdom, even in the midst of the storm, even when it's raging around us? So today we're going to look at a few different passages involving storms being calmed. Let's turn to Jonah 1. Jonah 1. First storm we're going to talk about today. We're not going to read the whole story, but we're going to get it started. I'm going to paraphrase some. But Jonah 1, starting in verse 1, it says, "Now the word of the Lord came to Jonah, the son of Amittai, saying, 'Arise, go to Nineveh, the great city, and call out against it, for their evil has come up before me.' But Jonah rose to flee to Tarshish from the presence of the Lord. He went down to Joppa and found a ship going to Tarshish. So he paid the fare and went down into it to go with them to Tarshish, away from the presence of the Lord. But the Lord hurled a great wind upon the sea, and there was a mighty tempest on the sea, so that the ship threatened to break up. Then the mariners were afraid, each cried out to his God, and they hurled the cargo that was in the ship into the sea to lighten it for them. But Jonah had gone down into the inner part of the ship and had lain down and was fast asleep. So the captain came and said to him, 'What do you mean, you sleeper? Arise, call to your God. Perhaps the God will give a thought to us, that we may not perish.'" So we see a big storm. God goes to Jonah, and he says, "Hey, I need you to give a convicting word to Nineveh, this massive city. I need you to go call them out." Jonah says, "Nah, not about it. That doesn't sound fun. That sounds really uncomfortable. Do you know what they might do to me if I call out a city like that, a pagan city?" He says, "Nah." He hops in a boat. He starts running from the presence of God. So not only is he disobeying God, but he's trying to get as far away from the presence of God as he can. Try that one. That's a tough one. It's tough to run from the presence of God. So he's disobeying. He's running from the presence. He's trying to go to Tarshish. It says in verse 4, "But the Lord hurled a great wind." Wait a second. The Lord hurled a great wind. That doesn't fit in our nice Jesus box. You know what I'm talking about? That nice Jesus box where we think Jesus is always just very nice, very kind, very gentle. In the pictures, he's always like this. very calm. That doesn't fit in the nice Jesus box. What do you mean God sent a storm? That's supposed to be the devil sending the storm. It says God sent the storm. He sent the wind. You know, not this coming series starting next week, but the one after that, we're going to be going through a series called Fierce Love. In this series, Fierce Love, we're going to look at the really tough and uncomfortable things that Jesus said and did. Because we like the nice Jesus stuff, but then when it comes to him giving the 7 woes of the Pharisees and the Sadducees, when it comes to him calling people whitewashed tombs, when it comes to him flipping tables, when it comes to him cursing fig trees, we feel a little uncomfortable. How many of you watched The Chosen? If you've watched the most recent season of Chosen, it's uncomfortable. It is tense. You're watching season 5, the week leading up to the cross, and things are tense. But if we're going to truly know Jesus, we have to know his full character. And it's easy sometimes to say, well, that, flipping tables and cursing fig trees and calling people out and all this kind of stuff, that doesn't really seem, brood of vipers, that doesn't sound very nice. And we can sometimes shy away from those aspects of Jesus, and it actually keeps us from knowing the depth of his goodness and love. I find that when we lean into the things that are really uncomfortable and really hard, it gives us a full picture of Jesus to where we truly understand his love. That in any of those moments, any of those conversations, he never once stepped out of love, even for the Pharisees. So we're going to go through this series where we're actually going to look at the really hard things. This is one of those hard things. God sent a wind. He sent a storm against Jonah when he was running away from him. As I was wrestling with this myself this week, it made me think of times where I've had loved ones or friends who just are in this place where they kept running from God. They kept running after all these other things. When God was inviting them to be healed, to be free, to walk separate, set apart from the world, they were just continually going their way. And you know what happens is my prayers change. My prayers change. Because sometimes people don't truly become humbled before God until it all falls apart. And my prayers change to say, God, would you let it unwind quickly? Whatever they're pursuing, whatever the enemy is got them hook, line, and sinker, would you let it unwind quickly? Same prayer for my life. God, whatever I'm building of my own kingdom, whatever I'm doing that's not according to what you're asking me to do, would you let it unwind quickly? That I might not waste precious time on this earth going after things that are never going to provide value in eternity. It's actually God's goodness that he sent the storm on Jonah. That his selfish endeavors would unwind quickly through the storm that God sent. God loved Jonah, and he loved Nineveh. So we see him send this storm. So what happens later on in the passage is all the crew is freaking out. They're trying to hold on for dear life. They're throwing things off the ship to try and lighten the load. Finally, they're like, we got to figure out whose fault this is. So they cast lots, fall straight to Jonah. They had him pegged. He didn't have a shot. And he doesn't even try and deny it. They go, what are we supposed to do? What have you done? What are we supposed to do? He says, you got to throw me overboard. He's just very straight. You got to throw me overboard. They're like, we can't throw you overboard? What are you talking about? So they keep rowing. They're rowing. They're trying to row through the storm, and they are not getting anywhere. So finally, they're about to throw Jonah, just like Jonah said, they're about to throw Jonah overboard. And they actually say a prayer, because these guys don't believe in Yahweh, but they know that he's a Hebrew and he serves Yahweh. So they actually say a prayer to Yahweh, and they say, hey, if you're up there, don't let this man's blood be on our head. And they toss him overboard. He gets tossed overboard, and instantly the storm ceases. And you can go read it for yourself this week, but they're so shocked that they actually sacrificed to Yahweh because they saw that he was the Lord of the storm. Amen. Wild story. The Bible is not dull. But we don't have time for that whole story. But what we recognize is God in his love can sometimes send storms. He wants to bring us into what he's doing. He doesn't want any of his kids to rebel. He doesn't want any of his kids to perish. Now, the reality is that the enemy also sends storms, okay? And it can also be that the enemy sends storms through our disobedience. We talked about authority, how Jesus had authority, that even the wind and the waves obeyed him. We talked a couple weeks ago when we were talking about power and authority, we talked about Romans 6:16, that you're a slave to the one whom you obey. So there are times when we operate in the kingdom of darkness, or we operate in the flesh, the enemy uses it to hijack our authority in a situation, and then we actually become a slave to the kingdom of darkness. Not because he has authority, not because he purchased authority or he should have authority over us, but simply because we yield it. We give it away. It's what we call an open door. We can open doors that the enemy should never have access to, but he'll gladly fill space that we make for him. But what we see here is that through disobedience and through trying to run from God, we can encounter storms. But we're going to look at some other storms that actually were not the result of disobedience as well. So let's go to Mark 4. We're going to start in verse 35. Mark 4:35. On that day, when evening had come, he said to them, "Let us go across to the other side." And leaving the crowd, they took him with them in a boat, just as he was. And other boats were with him, and a great windstorm arose, and the waves were breaking into the boat, so that the boat was already filling. But he was in the stern, asleep on the cushion. And they woke him and said to him, "Teacher, do you not care that we're perishing?" And he awoke and rebuked the wind and the sea, "Peace, be still." And the wind ceased, and there was a great calm. He said to them, "Why are you so afraid? Have you still no faith?" And they were filled with great fear and said to one another, "Who is this, that even the wind and the sea obey him?" Who is this, that even the wind and the sea obey him? There are three accounts that talk about this story. This one account is what gives the detail as to what the disciples said to him when they found him sleeping. "Teacher, do you not care that we are perishing?" How many of y'all have felt that going through a storm? God, don't you care? God, don't you care that I'm suffering here? God, don't you care for how long I've been going through this storm? God, don't you care that I'm out here alone with no one to support me? Oh, Jesus cares. When I was 21 and I was in the hospital, I've told pieces of this story, but each day I was getting sicker and sicker. I was in a season where I was consumed by a lot of idols surrounding vanity and body image and strength and reputation. I was working in a strength and conditioning facility. My life, even though I was a believer, so much of my life was tied up in these idols of vanity. I end up in the hospital. I'm sicker than I've ever been in my life, and I'm getting sicker every day that I'm in the hospital. Doctors can't figure out why. I think of myself as a pretty good Christian kid. I shouldn't be going through a storm like this. So on like day 3 or 4, every night the fevers had been getting worse, and I had people through all kinds of networks praying for me, like hundreds of people from all kinds of churches and networks. And I finally had it. You ever go and give God an ultimatum? I had it. I said, "God, this is enough." I said, "This needs to end tonight. Do you know how many people are praying for me? You're supposed to heal me, God. I even believe you're the healer, and you're not healing me. This needs to be done tonight." I was so frustrated. You know, you can get pretty vicious when idols are being stripped from you. Let's just be honest. These were idols that were being stripped from me, and I got to a vicious place in trying to defend those idols. So I said, "God, this needs to end tonight." You know how that night went? The worst of the nights in the hospital. So bad, they couldn't give me any more medicine to try and control my fevers that they just put ice packs all over me. And I was furious. "God, don't you realize that I'm perishing? why have you abandoned me? Why have you left me alone? Why aren't you calming this storm? He's saying, I haven't left you. I haven't abandoned you. I haven't forgotten about you. But he was trying to teach me. He was trying to teach me things through the storm, and he was trying to strip me of things that I needed to be stripped of in my heart. I needed to be set free. So in this moment, the disciples, unlike Jonah, the disciples are not running from the presence of God. They're literally with the Messiah in the boat, and they're still in a storm. Wondering why he's forgotten them. He hadn't forgotten them. He gets up, he says, you have little faith, why are you afraid? He rebukes the wind and the waves, and it goes calm, and they say, who is this? Let's go to one more story. Matthew 14. We're going to start in verse 22. Immediately, he made the disciples get into the boat and go before him to the other side, while he dismissed the crowds. And after he had dismissed the crowds, he went up on the mountain by himself to pray. When evening came, he was there alone, but the boat by this time was a long way from land, beaten by the waves, for the wind was against them. And in the fourth watch of the night, he came to them, walking on the sea. But when the disciples saw him walking on the sea, they were terrified and said, it's a ghost, and they cried out in fear. But immediately Jesus spoke to them, saying, take heart, it is I. Do not be afraid. And Jesus answered him, Lord, if it is you, command me to come to you on the water. He said, come. So Peter got out of the boat and walked on the water and came to Jesus. But when he saw the wind, he was afraid, and beginning to sink, he cried out, Lord, save me. Jesus immediately reached out his hand and took hold of him, saying to him, oh, you have little faith, why did you doubt? And when they got into the boat, the wind ceased, and those in the boat worshipped him, saying, truly, you are the Son of God. So Jonah disobeyed God, and he ran from God's presence and encountered a storm. The disciples, the first time, were literally in the presence of Jesus. He was literally with them on the boat, and they still went through a storm. Here, the disciples are literally being obedient to Jesus, going across the lake, and what do they run into? They're in the middle of a storm. Jesus told them to go to the other side. He had just fed the 5,000. In the Sea of Galilee, it's a long, slender, 13-mile long sea, or lake, really. And they're on the northeast corner of this lake. He tells them to go across. They end up in Gennesaret. So they're not even, Gennesaret is like the northwest side of the lake. So they're really just kind of going down the coast a little bit. They're not even going through like the girth of the lake. It's not like they're supposed to go through deep waters. But it says that they're blown out into deep waters. They got caught in this storm out of nowhere. What happens is that the Sea of Galilee is surrounded on many sides by mountains. And when cold air comes and blows up over the mountains and it mixes with warm air over the sea, all of a sudden it can drop these vicious storms out of nowhere. They're called charchias. So they get caught in this vicious storm. They get blown away from the seashore where they're trying to hug their way down the shoreline. They get blown into the midst of it. Jesus is out praying. They're just being beaten by the wind and the waves. They're spending all night struggling for their lives. It says that at the fourth watch, he came to them. What's the fourth watch? It's like 3 to 6 a.m. They are probably dead tired, struggling all night. They see Jesus, and obviously their first assumption is not that it's a person, because when would you ever assume that a person is walking to you in the middle of a storm? But particularly the Gentile communities of the time on the other side of the Sea of Galilee had a lot of superstitions about the water. They had these superstitions that there are ghosts in the water. And so they probably had heard stories from the Gentiles and think, oh man, there's someone walking on the water. It's probably a dead person's spirit. And they freak out. As they're freaking out, he says, take heart, it is I. Do not be afraid. In the midst of the storm, they're tired. In the midst of the storm's raging, the wind, the rain, They're in this probably a little boat, a little fisherman's boat that doesn't fit many more people than the disciples that were in that boat. They're probably getting tossed all night. They see what they think is a ghost, and then Jesus says a single sentence, and Peter picks it out of the storm. Take heart, it is I, do not be afraid. When we're in the midst of a storm, when we're tired, when we're frustrated, when we think we're hanging on for dear life, do we have the discernment to recognize his voice through the storm? Sometimes it's much easier to recognize God's voice when everything's falling into place and the sun is shining and there's nothing going wrong and we've got 2 months to decide on whatever decision we're making. But in that moment, Peter didn't have that. All he had was a single moment where Jesus says a phrase. Take heart, it is I. Do not be afraid. And he picks out Jesus' voice. You only recognize someone's voice to that degree when you've spent extensive time with someone. Have we spent time with Jesus in such a way that even with everything raging around us, we can pick his voice out of a storm? In that moment, I imagine that everything stopped for Peter. All the struggling, all the fear. I imagine everything just became like white noise to him. Him recognizing, I've heard that voice. I know that voice. He looks out at the silhouette. He says, Lord, if it's you, call me out. Jesus doesn't give him a long explanation. He doesn't give him a pep talk. Jesus says a single word. Come. The only way you're stepping out of a boat in the midst of a storm with a single word of a silhouette that you're not exactly sure is who you think it is with a massive amount of trust. Peter had that. He had that trust in Jesus. He says, I know that voice, even in the middle of a storm, and all I need is one word. Do we have that level of trust in our relationship with Christ? Jesus, you say the word. Even if my whole life hangs in the balance. Jesus, you give me one word, I'll put my whole life's safety on that step out of the boat. That's all I need. Do we have the attentiveness to his voice to even hear his voice in the storm? And then do we have the faith, the trust to need but a single word? To say, God, I'll put all my well-being on the line. Doesn't matter what happens, doesn't matter what harm, doesn't matter what goes wrong, whatever. If you're on the water, I want to be on the water. There's a historian named Brad Gray. He particularly has studied extensively first century Jewish culture and particularly discipleship culture. And he says it this way. When a disciple was under a rabbi, the disciple wasn't merely looking to know what the rabbi knew. It wasn't that sort of education. He wasn't just looking to know what the rabbi knew, he was looking to be what the rabbi was. So in first century discipleship, Peter's looking out to Jesus in the middle of the storm. Doesn't make sense, it's impossible. But his mentality is, I don't just want to know that Jesus can do that. If Jesus is walking on water, I want to be walking on water with him. I want to be who my rabbi is in every facet. I want to look like him, talk like him. If he's walking on water, I want to walk on water too. And Peter steps out of that boat, walks on the water towards Jesus, steps into the miraculous. But then it says that he saw the wind and the waves. His eyes had been fixed on Jesus. Everything else became white noise. But there's a moment where all of a sudden his attention went from Jesus back onto the wind and waves, and he began to sink. He instantly cries out, and Jesus reaches out and pulls him up. He says, you have little faith, why'd you doubt? He's like, you were walking on water. Notice he walks on water again. It says they walk back to the boat. Sometimes we're aware that he walked out to Jesus, but then after Jesus picked him back up, he's like, no, we're walking back. He puts you back on your feet. And it's not until they get back into the boat that the storm stops. Notice that. Jesus' first priority was not stopping the storm. It wasn't his first priority. Here's something that'll blow your mind. In Mark 6, the same account, it actually says, it's the only, of the three accounts of this story, it's the only one that says this. It says, Jesus meant to pass them by. Go read it. Same story. It says, Jesus meant to pass them by. He meant to pass them by. Jesus, they're fighting for their life. Jesus, I'm fighting for my life, and you just mean to pass me by? What is going on? Here's why I think it is. They were being obedient to what he had commanded. He commanded them to go across the lake. And when you're walking in the commission of Jesus, you carry the authority of Jesus. So any storm that comes against you, when you're walking in obedience to Jesus and in the commission that he's given you, you have authority over it. He was going to pass them by because they didn't need him. He's like, they've already got my authority. I've already vested it in them. If they only knew, if they only had faith, they could speak to the storm. The same way when he's called you to a purpose, he said, all authority in heaven and earth has been given to me, now go. When we're in the call, when we're in obedience to what God's given us, we walk in his authority that he's vested inside of us. He gets in the boat and the wind ceases. But the wind ceasing was secondary to the moment of encounter that Peter got to experience. Could you imagine how many times Peter recounted that story to people the rest of his life? Could you imagine the depth of relationship that came from that moment? In the middle of a storm, Jesus could have come, he could have put out the storm, and they would all gone, and they'd all seen it before, and cool, Jesus did it a second time. But in the midst of the storm, Jesus wasn't trigger happy to calm the storm, but he invited Peter to encounter. And it was actually Peter that asked to be with Jesus on the water. The same way that it might not be that our whole life is surrounded on the idea that we need to get rid of this storm. But Jesus, what are you doing in the storm? Where are my eyes fixed in the midst of the storm? Because when we figure that out, we realize that the storm is actually not the most important thing. The storm is not the focal point of our life. It's the fact that we're walking with him in his authority, in the midst of the storm, in the midst of whatever the enemy could throw against you. There's a different level of confidence that we walk in when we recognize this. So here's the deal. Whether you're obedient to God or disobedient, you'll go through storms. Whether you're disobedient like Jonah or whether you're obedient like the disciples, you'll go through storms. I can guarantee you that. Whether you're running away from the presence of God like Jonah or whether you're literally on a boat with the Messiah himself, you'll go through storms. Jesus never promises that it'll be easy. He never promises that there won't be pushback or storms or tribulations. In fact, in John 16, he tells the disciples, he's about to go to the cross, he tells the disciples, I tell you these things so that in me you might have peace. In me you may have peace. In this world there will be tribulation, but take heart, for I have overcome the world. There will be tribulation, but take heart, I've overcome the world. I am your peace. In Matthew 7, Jesus is talking about building your house. There's a wise man who builds his house on the rock by listening and obeying. It says the winds came, the rain crashed, the storm, everything. But the house didn't shake because it was grounded on the solid rock it was built on. So when we're grounded on the solid rock, the storm is just a detail. But like the fool, if we build our house on the sand, if we don't actually listen and obey, we're building our house on a bad foundation. The storm means a whole lot when we're standing on the wrong foundation. When we're on the right foundation, it's not all that significant. But in that passage, he's not saying if maybe a storm comes. But he's implying when a storm comes, you'll find out what you're built on. Build your house on the rock. Come on. So here are some of the most important things in a storm. Not the storm itself. What or who are you built on? Are you built on Him, the rock, the cornerstone? Are you built on your own kingdom, your own aspirations, your own work? Are you built on a kingdom of darkness? What rock are you built on? Matters a whole lot in a storm. 2, who do you actually believe is the Lord of the storm? Because a storm will lord over you unless you recognize who the Lord of the storm is. A storm will have authority over you unless you recognize who has authority over the storm. We have to recognize the Lord of the storm. Thirdly, we have to know where our eyes are fixed, where our gaze is fixed. Where our eyes are fixed makes all the difference in a storm. Jesus doesn't promise you won't go through storms, but He invites you to fix your eyes, to fix your gaze, to fix your perspective on Him in the midst of the wind and the waves that are spinning around you. Where are your eyes fixed in the storm? Jonah, his eyes were fixed on himself. When our eyes are fixed on ourselves in a storm, we'll be scrambling to try and salvage our own kingdom, our own desires, the things we've worked for, the things we've earned. Like Jonah, we'll be consumed with ourselves. Are your eyes fixed on the storm itself? In both the first story of the disciples as well as the first part of the second story, the disciples' whole attention was focused on the storm itself. They were holding on for dear life. When we're focused on the storm itself, it brings us to a place of being afraid, of stressed, overwhelmed, trying to control things, hopeless. And what ends up happening, in both accounts, it talks about the fear of the disciples. We see the fear of the disciples. That what you fear, you empower. Let me say that again. What you fear, you empower. Fear is faith in the wrong thing. Fear is faith in the wrong thing. Fear is actually faith that the enemy might actually have his way in the end, rather than recognizing and having faith that God will have His way in the end. What you fear, you empower. And when we're focused on the storm, we tend to give authority to the storm through our fear. Or is our focus fixed on Jesus, just like Peter getting out of the boat? Fixed gaze on Jesus Himself, to the point that the wind and the waves became secondary. The wind and the waves became part of the background. When we have our eyes fixed on Jesus, He'll lead us through the storm. He might not always extinguish the storm right away, because there might be things, just like with Peter, that He wants to do in that moment. There might be things He's wanting to teach in that moment. There might be greater levels of relationship that He's cultivating. There might be idols that He's stripping away in your heart because He loves you. Keep your eyes fixed on Jesus in the midst of the storm. Where are your eyes fixed in the midst of the storm? For those that right now in this moment are going through storms, this might be very real to you right now. The good news is He's not done with you yet. The good news is that He's got a plan and a purpose for you. There might be some shifting. There might be some ways you need to be obedient. There might be some ways that He's cultivating you for different things, but He isn't done with you yet. He hasn't brought you this far just to bring you this far. He's going to fulfill everything that He's begun in you. He's the author and the perfecter of your faith. Know that He's going to bring you through the storm. Keep your eyes fixed on Him. Keep your gaze upon Him. And know that He is the Lord of the storm. Build on the solid rock that'll weather that storm. Go ahead and stand with me. If you're in the middle of a storm, I want to invite you to come up that we can pray for you. You don't have to walk the storm alone. You don't have to walk the storm alone. He is going to be faithful in the midst of family, that we can walk together even when the storm seems vicious. And He'll faithfully walk you in the calling of your life, that you could walk in the confidence of knowing, God, this is where you've called me. I can have confidence no matter what storm comes my way. I can have confidence that I've been given authority from the one who is Lord of the storm. Even if I get blown out into the deep end, even when things don't go as expected, I can walk in confidence in the one who is Lord of the storm. So I invite you, come up that we could pray for you. God, we thank you that you are the Lord of the storm. We thank you that we have your word, that we could learn and grow in the confidence that we have in Christ. God, that we can listen and obey. You've given us your word that we can listen and obey and build our house on the rock to such a degree that when the storm comes, we can walk unshakable. That though the earth around us may totter, though the kingdoms of this world may fall, there's a river whose streams make glad the city of God. That even in the midst of a wild storm, we could encounter you just like Peter. God, would you give us that discernment? Would you give us, we want to have that history with you, that even in the midst of a wild storm, we can pick your voice out of it. We want that discernment, but it doesn't just come from someone praying over us and all of a sudden we know his voice. God, we want to press into your voice. We want to know your word. We want to listen for your voice. We want to test your voice that we could grow in maturity of hearing your voice. Grow in the maturity of the trust, the depth of trust and relationship we have with you, that all you need to say is come. One word in the middle of a storm, that we'd have such a depth of trust and faith that we take you at your word and come. God, I thank you that as you lead us as a family, as a congregation, as you lead us on the mission that you've given us, we don't have to worry about the storms that are to come. They're going to come. The storms might rage, but we can walk in confidence in the authority you've given us. So God, would you develop in us that we wouldn't just try to live a life that avoids storms, but we would be more attentive to where you're calling us regardless of the storm. That we'd simply listen and obey. That we wouldn't just want to know what you know, but we'd want to be as you are, your disciples. In Jesus' name, amen. God bless you guys.